The year was 1777. 2 years had passed since the American colonies first declared their independence, and the struggle for survival had entered its most dangerous stage. The world's most powerful empire, Great Britain, had no intention of letting go of its colonies without a crushing fight, and for the ragged Continental Army, under the command of George Washington, every campaign felt like a gamble between survival and annihilation. As summer gave way to autumn, the fate of the Revolution narrowed to a single city, Philadelphia. This bustling port, with its warehouses, workshops, and political halls, served as the capital of the young nation. The Continental Congress met there, debated there, and carried the fragile dream of liberty on their shoulders. If Philadelphia were to fall, the Revolution might lose both its heart and its legitimacy. The British commander, General Sir William Howe, knew this. He sought not just to win battles, but to break the morale of the rebellion by striking directly at its nerve center. Philadelphia represented more than streets and buildings. It represented the will of a people daring to defy their king. And if Howe could capture it, the world might believe the colonial cause was doomed. On the other side stood George Washington, still untested as a commander of large armies. His victories at Trenton and Princeton had proven his daring, but now he faced a campaign on a much larger scale. The British had already seized New York City in 1776, and their fleet roamed the eastern seaboard with impunity. To lose Philadelphia as well would leave Washington cornered, stripped of resources, and perhaps stripped of confidence. The stage was set. 2 armies, tens of thousands of soldiers, would soon converge along the banks of Brandywine Creek, a twisting, muddy barrier running through the Pennsylvania countryside. It was here, on September 11th, 1777, that one of the largest battles of the American Revolution would unfold. A day of thunder and fire, smoke and blood. A day that would shape the course of the war itself. Picture the Pennsylvania countryside on the eve of battle. Farmers had harvested their fields and stored away grain, yet now their lands bristled with soldiers. Tents stretched across meadows, muskets gleamed in the fading light, and cannons stood silently, waiting for dawn. The orchards and ridges, once peaceful, became outposts and picket lines. Washington's army gathered in anxious anticipation. The men were weary, their uniforms ragged, but their spirits remained fierce. Many were farmers and tradesmen who had left their homes to fight for independence. Others were veterans hardened by the campaigns of the past 2 years. They looked toward Washington with loyalty, knowing that his decisions in the coming hours might decide their fate. Across the field, the British Army prepared with equal determination. Howe commanded professional soldiers, drilled and disciplined, supported by German auxiliaries hired from the Principality of Hesse. Their scarlet coats and gleaming bayonets marked them as the arm of empire, and their confidence came from centuries of military tradition. To them, the Continental Army appeared as little more than rebellious amateurs, yet they knew Washington's men had proven resilient before. The contrast could not have been sharper, an empire of might facing a nation still in its infancy. But both sides understood one thing clearly. The outcome of this battle might tilt the Revolution itself. Why was Philadelphia so important? Because in 1777, the Revolution still balanced on a knife's edge. France and Spain watched carefully from across the Atlantic, undecided about whether to openly support the American cause. They waited for proof that the colonies could stand against Britain's power. A crushing defeat might discourage them. A stubborn defense might inspire them to act. Washington knew this. He knew that every river crossed, every position defended, and every retreat endured sent ripples across the world. If Philadelphia could be protected, Congress might continue its work unhindered, and foreign allies might be persuaded that the rebellion was not doomed. If it were lost, then even his army's courage might not be enough to save the dream of independence. Howe, for his part, saw the campaign as the means to deliver a decisive blow. His strategy called for a sweeping advance from the Chesapeake Bay northward, outflanking Washington's positions and seizing Philadelphia before winter. It was bold, calculated, and dangerous, for it stretched his supply lines deep into hostile countryside. Yet Howe believed that by crushing Washington's army, he could end the war with one stroke. The eyes of both armies, and indeed of the world, now turned toward Pennsylvania. Washington and Howe were men of different backgrounds and temperaments, yet both carried the burden of history upon their shoulders. Washington, the Virginian planter, had grown into the reluctant general of a revolution he never sought, but could not refuse. Howe, the seasoned professional, commanded Britain's might with precision and confidence, though not without hesitation in his choices. Between them stretched the Brandywine, a shallow but twisting creek, lined with steep banks and treacherous fords. Washington believed the terrain offered him a chance to block the British advance. He stationed his men along the crossings, determined to hold the line. Yet the battle would not unfold as he imagined, for Howe had studied the ground as carefully as Washington, and he intended not only to strike at the front but to sweep around the flank, crushing the Continentals in a maneuver worthy of Europe's finest armies. As dawn approached on September 11th, the air hung heavy with mist. Soldiers tightened their belts, shouldered their muskets, and waited for the first crack of gunfire. Drums echoed across the fields, hooves clattered on dirt roads, and officers studied their maps by lantern light. The world held its breath. This was no minor skirmish. This was to be a clash of empires and ideals. The fate of Philadelphia, and with it, the fate of the Revolution, rested on the fields and ridges of Brandywine. Within hours, the landscape would erupt in smoke, fire, and blood. Men who dreamed of liberty would stand against the Empire of Britain, uncertain whether they would live to see another sunset. The story of Brandywine is the story of desperation and valor, of cunning maneuvers and costly mistakes, of foreign volunteers who shed blood for freedom, and of future leaders whose lives were shaped on its fields. It is the story of a young nation fighting not only for survival, but for recognition, dignity, and the hope of generations to come. And so, as we step into the events of that September day, we must remember, history is not only written by victors, but forged in the dust, the smoke, and the fury of battle. This is the Battle of Brandywine. The summer of 1777 settled heavily across Pennsylvania, carrying both the ordinary rhythms of farm life and the extraordinary tension of approaching war. Fields once filled with quiet labor now carried the weight of distant conflict, as families worked their land under uncertain skies. Farmers plowed soil without knowing if their harvest would feed their households or be seized by armies passing through their villages. Roads once meant for wagons carrying produce to market were now filled with marching columns of soldiers bearing muskets and worn boots. Drums echoed across the countryside, their relentless beats reminding communities that the war was drawing ever closer to their doorsteps. Mothers and children watched from shuttered windows as unfamiliar banners passed, uncertain if their homes would be spared or consumed by violence. For George Washington, the weight of leadership pressed relentlessly. Every decision a delicate balance between desperation and determination in the fight for liberty. His Continental Army was not a professional force, but a fragile band of volunteers, farmers, clerks, and artisans turned reluctant soldiers. Many were poorly trained, underfed, and ill-equipped, yet they carried an unwavering belief that freedom was worth the sacrifice of everything. Philadelphia was not merely a city, but a living symbol, the heart of the Revolution where Congress declared independence and debated the nation's future. To lose Philadelphia would mean more than losing territory. It would mean striking a blow against the very soul of independence itself. On the British side, the goals were equally heavy. For General Howe faced mounting pressure from London to crush the rebellion quickly. He had already faced criticism for failing to decisively end the war, and now Parliament demanded the capture of Philadelphia as proof. Howe's army was disciplined, well supplied, and armed with the confidence of empire. Yet even they felt the grueling strain of the campaign. Endless marches in oppressive summer heat drained their stamina, and long supply lines carried both necessities and uncertainty across the rough countryside. The landscape of Pennsylvania itself became an adversary, with its rolling hills, thick woods, and winding creeks complicating every military decision. Brandywine Creek, meandering through quiet farmlands, seemed ordinary. Yet it soon would become the stage for a monumental clash of empires. For most soldiers, it was simply a river to cross, but for generals it was an obstacle that could decide Philadelphia's fate. Washington believed its ridges and fords could shield his fragile army, buying time and protecting the revolutionary capital from swift destruction. Howe studied the geography with patience, seeking the moment to strike with precision, hoping to outmaneuver Washington and crush resistance in one blow. Scouts moved silently through the forests, reporting rumors of enemy positions, while couriers carried messages along dangerous paths vulnerable to sudden capture. Washington depended on incomplete intelligence, constantly uncertain whether his assessments of British movement matched the reality unfolding beyond his sight. Howe, in contrast, relied on patience and deception, concealing his maneuvers until the moment came to unleash overwhelming and decisive force. Both generals knew the stakes were immense, and both armies braced for the clash, each step echoing with the weight of history. As the sun set on September 10th, tension gripped the countryside, households praying the storm would pass without consuming their homes. When dawn broke on September 11th, it revealed not peaceful fields, but two armies preparing to carve their fate into history. The air was thick with anticipation, as though the world itself held its breath before the thunder of muskets and cannons. Farmers gathered families into cellars, their lives caught between empires, while soldiers cleaned muskets and sharpened bayonets for the battle ahead. For the Continental Army, the moment carried the promise of honor or the risk of collapse, with liberty balanced upon their shoulders. For the British, it carried the opportunity to break resistance entirely, seizing the capital and crushing morale in one decisive stroke. The Brandywine was no longer just a creek, it was destiny, a place where courage, blood, and sacrifice would shape the Revolution's future. The American Revolutionary War was not a single moment of rebellion, but a long, grinding conflict stretching across years of uncertainty. By 1777, the war had already shifted dramatically, with battles in New England giving way to struggles across New York and Pennsylvania. Philadelphia stood at the heart of this conflict, not only as a major city, but as the symbolic seat of revolutionary independence. It was here that the Continental Congress had declared separation from Britain, and it remained the nerve center of the Patriot cause. For George Washington, defending Philadelphia meant defending more than stone buildings and cobbled streets. It meant preserving the spirit of the Revolution. To the British, capturing Philadelphia promised more than simple occupation. It offered the chance to demoralize rebels and disrupt the very machinery of resistance. The Delaware River and the city's central location gave it strategic importance, connecting supply lines and influencing the movement of entire armies. Whoever controlled Philadelphia controlled a vital artery of the rebellion, making the city an irresistible prize for Britain's grand military campaign. General William Howe, the British commander, believed that taking Philadelphia could cripple revolutionary momentum and bring the war closer to resolution. Howe's strategy contrasted sharply with earlier British campaigns, focused on cutting off New England from the other colonies through control of New York. Instead, Howe saw Pennsylvania as the true target, a place where striking decisively might silence the increasingly defiant Continental Congress. Washington, aware of Howe's intentions, recognized that his army stood as the fragile barrier between independence and collapse of the revolutionary dream. He had already suffered defeats in previous campaigns, and critics doubted whether he possessed the skill to hold the revolution together. Yet Washington's presence carried immense weight, inspiring loyalty even among soldiers who marched barefoot and endured hunger in their pursuit of freedom. Opposing him was General Howe, a seasoned commander who combined patience with cunning, carefully plotting movements to outmaneuver rather than recklessly overpower his enemy. At Howe's side was Lord Charles Cornwallis, a bold and aggressive officer who relished the opportunity to deliver crushing blows against American forces. Together, Howe and Cornwallis represented Britain's most formidable leadership in America, determined to finish what years of conflict had left unresolved. On the American side, Washington's leadership was strengthened by figures like the young Marquis de Lafayette, who had recently joined the cause. Lafayette, though inexperienced, brought not only enthusiasm but the promise of French sympathy, a connection that might prove invaluable in time. Other officers, like Nathaniel Greene and Anthony Wayne, helped shape the backbone of Washington's command, providing both strategic insight and regional knowledge. This mixture of seasoned veterans and eager volunteers created an American command structure that was both fragile and resilient in equal measure. The British, meanwhile, enjoyed an advantage in discipline, training, and supplies, with regiments hardened by years of experience in European conflicts. Their red-coated soldiers carried polished muskets and marched in disciplined lines, their appearance alone striking fear into less seasoned American fighters. German auxiliaries, known as Hessians, added further strength to Britain's army, bringing disciplined mercenary soldiers into the fight for Philadelphia. Washington understood that facing such forces head-on was perilous, yet he also knew retreating endlessly could shatter morale and trust. The Continental Army had to prove it could stand and fight, or risk losing the confidence of both soldiers and Congress. The larger context of 1777 showed both promise and peril, with Britain seeking decisive victory and America struggling to endure its hardships. The Northern Campaign in New York, led by General Burgoyne, aimed to cut New England off, while Howe struck toward Philadelphia simultaneously. This dual strategy reflected Britain's determination to isolate rebellious colonies and stamp out resistance through pressure on multiple fronts. But such divided efforts also stretched British resources thin, creating opportunities Washington hoped to exploit if he could withstand immediate threats. Amid these high-level strategies, ordinary soldiers bore the brunt of hardship, their daily lives consumed by hunger, disease, and the fear of death. Many enlisted men lacked proper clothing, their boots worn thin from endless marches across unforgiving terrain in the sweltering summer heat. Rations were inconsistent, sometimes spoiled, leaving soldiers to forage or rely on sympathetic civilians to sustain them through long campaigns. Yet their spirit endured, bound together by loyalty to Washington and the hope that independence was worth their immense suffering. The Revolution was not only a military struggle, but a test of endurance, patience, and belief in a future not yet secured. Philadelphia embodied that hope, its cobbled streets and meeting halls echoing with voices that demanded liberty, despite the looming threat of defeat. Both armies knew that the campaign for Philadelphia would not only decide military control, but also influence international opinion across Europe. France in particular watched closely, weighing whether the American cause was strong enough to justify open support against their British rivals. The events of 1777, especially battles like Brandywine, carried consequences far beyond Pennsylvania, shaping decisions made in distant royal courts. Into this complex theater arrived Casimir Pulaski, a Polish nobleman and cavalry officer who had offered his sword to Washington's cause. Pulaski's arrival in the summer of 1777 symbolized the growing international dimension of the Revolution, showing that America's struggle inspired foreign allies. Though not yet given a command, Pulaski's reputation as a skilled cavalryman carried promise, offering Washington expertise in the art of mounted warfare. His presence also reminded the Continental Army that their struggle resonated beyond their borders, drawing volunteers willing to share in their fate. This blending of Americans and foreign supporters gave the revolutionary cause both strength and legitimacy in the eyes of watching nations. As summer pressed on, all eyes turned toward Philadelphia, where the decisions of commanders and the courage of soldiers would shape history. Among the men preparing for the campaign, there were several who would later hold extraordinary positions in the young American Republic. John Marshall, at that time only a young soldier, fought with Maxwell's light infantry during the campaign surrounding the Brandywine. Though his role was modest compared to towering generals, Marshall's presence linked the revolutionary battlefield to the future Supreme Court of America. He would later become Chief Justice, shaping the Constitution itself. Yet here he was a soldier in the mud and smoke. His experiences in battle hardened his perspective, forging a connection between law, government, and the human cost of defending liberty. James Monroe, another young man destined for future leadership, also stood among Washington's ranks as the campaign unfolded. Monroe, who would one day become president, was still just a young officer facing the relentless uncertainty of the revolutionary battlefield. His ability to speak French made him valuable in moments requiring communication with foreign allies, including when Lafayette was gravely wounded. The presence of such future leaders within Washington's army revealed how deeply the Revolution touched the lives of America's future statesmen. The war was not distant from politics. It shaped the very generation who would later govern the nation they fought to establish. For Washington, however, the immediate concern was not future legacies, but the survival of his fragile army and the defense of Philadelphia. He knew his soldiers could not match the British in discipline or training, so he relied on terrain, positioning, and resolve. Defending Philadelphia meant positioning his troops along Brandywine Creek, where ridges, fords, and narrow crossings might even the overwhelming odds. The geography of the region mattered deeply, for every hill, ford, and woodline offered either protection or vulnerability in the unfolding campaign. The British studied these same landscapes, calculating how best to cross the creek and crush Washington's defense before marching to Philadelphia. This chessboard of rivers, hills, and hidden paths would soon define the outcome of one of the largest battles of the war. While generals considered maps and strategy, ordinary civilians braced for devastation, knowing their homes and farms might become unwilling battlegrounds. Some supported the Patriot cause and offered food or information, while others leaned toward the crown, hoping for protection from British order. This divided loyalty reflected the fractured state of America itself, where not all colonists agreed on the meaning of independence. Quaker communities around Pennsylvania often tried to remain neutral, but neutrality proved fragile when armies marched across their farmland. The Revolution was not only a conflict of armies, but also a civil struggle, with neighbors sometimes divided across bitter political lines. Philadelphia, with its bustling port and thriving trade, represented both economic and symbolic value, making its defense or capture immensely consequential. The British hoped its fall would weaken revolutionary zeal, but Washington intended to prove that his ragged army could still endure. The eyes of the world, especially France, were fixed on these developments, measuring whether America's resistance carried hope or hopelessness. Pulaski's arrival earlier in the summer reminded Washington that foreign observers saw potential in the American cause despite its hardships. Though not yet commanding troops directly, Pulaski's counsel in cavalry tactics offered Washington a new dimension in his defensive planning. Foreign officers like Pulaski, Lafayette, and others symbolized international investment in the struggle, foreshadowing alliances that could eventually tip the balance. For the moment, however, survival was uncertain, and Washington knew defeat near Philadelphia might cripple his army's credibility. His men were exhausted from weeks of maneuvering, their clothes ragged and their weapons often in poor condition compared to British arms. Yet they carried something their opponents lacked, a cause that reached beyond pay, beyond orders, into the very core of human freedom. This sense of fighting for liberty gave Washington's soldiers resilience, though it often had to compete with hunger, fatigue, and despair. Discipline was inconsistent, desertion remained a constant threat, and yet when battle loomed, many men found courage in their comrades. By September of 1777, Washington had positioned his army along the Brandywine, confident that his intelligence provided a clear picture of enemy movements. He believed Howe would attempt a direct crossing, and thus concentrated forces along the most obvious fords near Chad's Ford. This defensive stance seemed logical, yet it relied heavily on the accuracy of intelligence that would soon prove dangerously incomplete. The British, meanwhile, were preparing a plan that combined deception with precision, one that might shatter Washington's careful arrangements. But before those maneuvers could unfold, the background of this campaign set the stage. A city at stake, leaders under pressure, and soldiers enduring hardships. Philadelphia's defense was not simply a military matter, but a symbol of whether the revolution itself could endure another devastating campaign. Into this fragile moment stepped Washington's young officers, future presidents, and foreign allies, all bound together by a cause greater than themselves. The Brandywine was waiting, its waters calm yet destined to be broken by gunfire, smoke, and the cries of thousands of men. History was moving relentlessly toward September 11, 1777, when this background of strategy, politics, and hardship would erupt into violent confrontation. In the weeks leading to the Battle of Brandywine, troop movements and strategic decisions created a tense and uncertain atmosphere. General Howe, commanding the British, had abandoned his earlier position in New Jersey and taken his army by sea toward the Chesapeake. This maneuver confused Washington at first, for many suspected Howe might move northward to reinforce General Burgoyne's advance from Canada instead. Instead, Howe chose to sail south, landing near Head of Elk in Maryland, what is now Elkton, Maryland, placing his army within striking distance of Philadelphia. The journey had been long and difficult, with soldiers cramped aboard ships, suffering from heat, storms, and shortages of fresh water. By early September, Howe's men were eager to march, determined to deliver a decisive blow against Washington's Continental Army in the field. Washington, positioned near Wilmington, received word of Howe's landing, and quickly began moving his forces northward toward Brandywine Creek in Pennsylvania. The geography of the region played a critical role in the developing campaign, as Brandywine Creek formed a natural defensive barrier. The creek stretched across the countryside with steep banks and fords that could be used either as choke points or vulnerabilities. Washington believed that holding the line at Brandywine was the best way to protect Philadelphia from imminent British occupation. His officers, including Nathaniel Greene, Anthony Wayne, and John Sullivan, debated various defensive arrangements to ensure the army could withstand British assault. The challenge lay in the size of the battlefield, for the Brandywine stretched across several miles with numerous possible crossing points. If Washington guessed correctly, his position could be nearly impregnable, forcing Howe to waste men and time on costly frontal attacks. But if Howe found an unguarded crossing and struck from behind, Washington's entire army might face encirclement and destruction on the field. Both sides, therefore, engaged in cautious maneuvers, with scouts, cavalry, and local informants attempting to gather intelligence on enemy positions. The Americans relied heavily on local militia, farmers, and sympathizers to provide knowledge of terrain, roads, and river fords. Yet information was often contradictory, incomplete, or simply wrong, leaving Washington uncertain about where to expect the British to strike hardest. Meanwhile, British officers carefully studied maps and consulted loyalists familiar with the Pennsylvania countryside, seeking opportunities to exploit American weaknesses. The countryside itself offered rolling hills, wooded patches, and scattered farms, all of which would soon become landmarks in the bloody clash. The soldiers of both armies spent restless nights in makeshift camps, sharpening bayonets, cleaning muskets, and whispering about the coming engagement. For the Americans, there was the constant question of whether they could finally stand and fight effectively against seasoned British regulars. The British, though confident in their discipline, knew from experience that the rebels fought stubbornly when defending their homes and liberties. Thus, both sides prepared for a battle that promised to be decisive, shaping the fate of Philadelphia and perhaps the war itself. Washington placed his forces along the eastern bank of Brandywine Creek, stretching across fords from Pyle's Ford to Chad's Ford. Chad's Ford, lying along the main Philadelphia road, seemed the most obvious point of attack and thus received the strongest defenses. Artillery was positioned to command the approaches, while infantry entrenched themselves in defensive lines overlooking the shallow but wide crossing. Other fords, such as Brinton's Ford and Jeffress Ford farther north, were less heavily defended, as Washington assumed they were difficult to access. This assumption would later prove dangerously flawed, for Howe was a master at deception and maneuver, rarely attacking where most expected. Meanwhile, American morale was cautiously optimistic, bolstered by recent drills and Washington's encouragement that their cause remained righteous and just. Young officers like Lafayette threw themselves into preparations, eager to prove their worth and demonstrate the value of foreign alliances. The arrival of Casimir Pulaski that summer had also invigorated the army, as his cavalry skills promised new flexibility in battlefield tactics. Pulaski, a Polish nobleman, had offered his services to Congress, soon to be appointed as a general in charge of cavalry. His presence reminded many soldiers that the American fight for liberty resonated far beyond the colonies, inspiring allies across Europe. In campfires at night, discussions ranged from strategy to survival, with men worrying about food, ammunition, and the unpredictable weather. On September 10th, the night before battle, the region was filled with movement as both armies positioned themselves for the coming clash. Drums beat, horses snorted, and the sounds of marching feet carried across the Pennsylvania countryside under the fading summer sun. The air was heavy with anticipation, for tomorrow the Brandywine would no longer be a quiet creek, but a line of blood. As dawn approached on September 11th, the fog clung heavily to the fields and low ground along the Brandywine. The thick mist concealed troop movements, leaving both armies uncertain about the exact strength and positions of their opponents. Washington deployed his main force near Chad's Ford, certain that the British would advance directly along the Philadelphia road. This decision was logical, as the ford lay at the center of the American line and guarded the most obvious path forward. Artillery batteries were placed to sweep the approaches, while Continental infantry braced themselves for what they expected would be a frontal clash. John Sullivan's division stretched northward, covering several fords, though they lacked strong reinforcements or detailed intelligence about possible enemy maneuvers. Maxwell's light infantry, including young John Marshall, future Chief Justice of the United States, was stationed in advanced positions to harass the enemy. Marshall and his comrades patrolled the edges of woodland and field, determined to delay any British crossing attempts with swift skirmishes. The presence of men like Marshall, still untested in large-scale battle, reflected how deeply the Revolution had drawn in future leaders. Meanwhile, Washington's cavalry, including Pulaski's recently arrived contingent, scouted the countryside but struggled to cover the vast stretches of terrain effectively. Reports filtered in from local farmers and militiamen, but their accounts were often conflicting or confused by the morning fog. Some swore that large bodies of redcoats were moving toward Chad's Ford, while others insisted the enemy was marching far to the north. This uncertainty left Washington in a difficult position, forced to gamble on incomplete information in order to defend Philadelphia. The British, however, had planned their movements with deliberate cunning, aiming to exploit both the fog and the Americans' assumptions. General Knyphausen advanced slowly with a portion of the army directly toward Chadds Ford, creating noise and pressure to distract Washington. Meanwhile, Howe and Cornwallis led the main body northward in a wide flanking march, crossing the Brandywine miles above the American line. This maneuver, though risky due to distance and terrain, promised to fall upon Washington's right flank with devastating effect. The strategy echoed Howe's earlier successes, using deception and maneuver to unbalance his opponents, rather than charging headlong into strong defenses. While Washington prepared for a clash at Chadds Ford, the true danger was steadily advancing beyond his immediate line of sight. Scouts did bring warnings that the British might be attempting a flanking march, but the information was slow and not fully trusted. Washington, uncertain, kept much of his strength fixed in place, unwilling to thin his defenses until he had firmer intelligence. Meanwhile, American soldiers tried to occupy their anxious hours by cooking meager meals, repairing gear, and writing hurried letters to loved ones. Lafayette, ever restless, rode among the troops, speaking of honor, courage, and the importance of standing firm for liberty. He sensed that tomorrow might test both his resolve and that of the young nation he had pledged himself to support. Thus, the stage was set, one army waiting for a direct assault, the other preparing to strike unexpectedly from the north. The fog lifted slowly, and the first sounds of musket fire crackled across the creek, marking the beginning of the battle. The early skirmishing at Chadds Ford gave the Americans the impression that the British main force was pressing directly against their center. Maxwell's light infantry fought stubbornly, using fences, trees, and uneven ground to delay British advances and give the illusion of stronger resistance. The sharp crack of muskets echoed through the countryside, mingling with the thunder of British artillery shells bursting across the creek. Washington, observing from a commanding height, believed these attacks represented the opening stage of a full-scale assault on his defenses. He directed reinforcements toward Chadds Ford, further committing to the idea that the British were attempting to break his center by force. For hours the ruse held, as Knyphausen pressed forward with enough energy to occupy the Americans and keep them firmly engaged. Meanwhile, Howe and Cornwallis steadily advanced on the long northern march, moving across rough roads toward Jeffress's Ford, largely unopposed by Americans. The march was exhausting, with British soldiers trudging through heat, dust, and narrow lanes. Yet the promise of surprise drove them onward. Local Loyalist guides ensured the column avoided detection, steering them along routes where American scouts were unlikely to venture during the morning. By mid-afternoon, the British flanking column reached the upper Brandywine, successfully crossing at Jeffress's Ford and preparing to descend upon Washington's right. It was only then that clearer reports began reaching American headquarters, suggesting that enemy forces were appearing in the northern countryside. Some messengers insisted the movements were large and threatening, while others dismissed them as mere rumors or exaggerations by frightened locals. Washington hesitated, uncertain whether to believe these warnings, as so many earlier reports had proven misleading or contradictory. His generals debated fiercely, with some urging him to reinforce the right immediately, while others cautioned against weakening Chadds Ford defenses too soon. The lack of precise intelligence reflected the broader challenges of Revolutionary War Command, where information often traveled slowly and unreliably. Meanwhile, American soldiers continued to dig, prepare, and brace for what they thought would be a direct clash across the ford. The men sharpened bayonets, whispered prayers, and stared across the water at the faint outlines of British redcoats gathering in smoke. None realized that the true hammer of the British army was descending from the north, ready to strike with crushing force. Lafayette, riding tirelessly, sensed the confusion, and urged Washington to act decisively, warning that hesitation could spell disaster for the army. His youth and foreign origin did not diminish the respect he had earned, for his passion gave hope even amid uncertainty. In the distance, the rumble of marching feet and wagons carried faintly on the wind, hinting at the hidden column approaching. By late afternoon, it was undeniable. The northern horizon darkened with British troops moving rapidly to envelop the American flank. The trap was closing, and Washington now faced the chilling realization that his army might soon be caught between two enemy forces. The morning of September 11th, 1777, dawned over Brandywine Creek with an uneasy stillness, as both armies prepared for engagement across open fields. Continental soldiers, many young and inexperienced, huddled in defensive lines, their muskets glinting in the early sunlight, waiting for the British advance. The sound of drums and bugles soon pierced the air, signaling to both sides that the confrontation was imminent and unavoidable. British units under General Knyphausen advanced steadily toward Chad's Ford, meeting initial resistance from American light infantry and local militia positioned along the bank. Musket fire erupted in sporadic bursts, the sharp crack carrying across fields and causing smoke to drift lazily above the water. Maxwell's troops fought bravely, firing volleys and retreating in good order, buying precious time for Washington's main line to prepare. The American artillery, positioned on slightly elevated ground, unleashed thunderous cannon fire across the ford, inflicting casualties on advancing British formations. Despite the Americans' determined resistance, Knyphausen's forces pushed forward steadily, exploiting every gap and weakness along the river crossing. Meanwhile, Washington maintained a commanding perspective, adjusting lines, shifting reinforcements, and coordinating orders amid the chaos of the unfolding skirmishes. His staff relayed reports from scouts, though intelligence remained imperfect, with conflicting accounts of enemy strength and movements complicating strategic choices. At the same time, Howe and Cornwallis executed the wide flanking maneuver from the north, advancing through difficult terrain to approach Washington's right flank. The column moved with caution, keeping formation across narrow lanes and wooded paths, yet its progress remained largely undetected by American scouts. Local loyalist guides helped British troops navigate unfamiliar countryside, avoiding potential ambushes and ensuring the element of surprise was preserved. Pulaski's cavalry, newly integrated into the Continental forces, patrolled forward positions, searching for signs of enemy movement and attempting to disrupt reconnaissance. Despite his efforts, the British flanking column advanced with precision, crossing Brandywine's upper fords and positioning itself to strike the American right decisively. Lafayette, youthful and energetic, rode among American lines, urging officers and soldiers alike to hold positions and maintain morale under the pressure of continuous firing. His presence inspired many, yet even he could not fully comprehend the scale of the maneuver unfolding beyond the horizon. American infantry fired disciplined volleys, retreating methodically under pressure, trying to delay British advances long enough for reserves to be repositioned. The chaos of battle was amplified by uneven terrain, smoke, and the constant need to reload muskets while maintaining formation against superior numbers. As the morning wore on, casualties mounted on both sides, yet neither army wavered, knowing that the outcome of this engagement could shape the war's trajectory. Amid the smoke and confusion, messengers galloped between units, conveying Washington's orders, though some arrived too late to alter the course of skirmishes already underway. By late morning, the British flanking column had reached positions that threatened the Continental right, unseen by many of Washington's forward observers. Howe and Cornwallis prepared their troops to advance against the exposed flank, using wooded terrain and rising ground to conceal their formations. American officers grew increasingly concerned as reports indicated a significant force moving to envelop their right, yet orders were slow to reach frontline units. Washington recognized the danger immediately and attempted to reposition his divisions, sending reinforcements northward to counter the unfolding British threat. The terrain complicated movement, with narrow lanes, fences, and thick underbrush slowing the transfer of troops to critical positions along the right. Lafayette, aware of the danger, rode tirelessly between units, relaying orders, encouraging men, and attempting to organize a coherent response under heavy pressure. Casimir Pulaski, commanding cavalry, moved quickly to scout the northern approach, seeking ways to delay British forces and provide critical intelligence to Washington. Despite these efforts, Cornwallis's flanking maneuver threatened to strike deep into American lines, potentially splitting the army and forcing a collapse of the defensive position. The Continental artillery, positioned to support the center, struggled to adjust angles of fire to cover the advancing flanking force effectively. Musket volleys erupted intermittently, yet the smoke and terrain limited visibility, leaving many soldiers firing at shadows and vague movement across the fields. John Marshall and other light infantry officers attempted skirmishes to slow the British, engaging in sharp, localized firefights before withdrawing toward stronger positions. The Americans' understanding of British strength remained incomplete, creating uncertainty and delay in Washington's efforts to orchestrate an effective counterattack. Meanwhile, Knyphausen pressed forward at Chadds Ford, keeping Washington focused on the frontal threat, unaware that the real danger was now unfolding along the northern flank. The overlapping pressures created confusion, as units faced simultaneous threats from multiple directions, testing both discipline and morale under extreme conditions. Lafayette received a wound to his leg while attempting to rally troops in a contested sector, yet he remained conscious and committed to maintaining order among retreating units. Monroe, observing the aftermath of the skirmish, rushed to check on Lafayette, using his knowledge of French to communicate and coordinate immediate medical assistance. The British advanced steadily, exploiting every gap in the American lines, their disciplined formations pressing forward despite heavy resistance. American soldiers, many exhausted from weeks of marching and poor rations, struggled to maintain cohesion in the face of flanking fire and overwhelming numbers. Washington moved to reinforce the threatened sector, personally directing brigades, though delays caused by terrain and miscommunication hindered the speed of response. Pulaski's cavalry attempted charges to disrupt British formations, yet dense woods and muddy fields limited their effectiveness, allowing the flanking column to continue its advance. Amidst the chaos, officers shouted orders, drums beat, and cannon fire roared, creating a cacophony of sounds that marked the unfolding disaster for the American right. By midday, it became clear that the British had successfully executed the flanking maneuver, threatening to collapse Washington's defenses and forcing a reassessment of the Army's positions. As the British flanking force pressed forward, panic began to ripple through portions of the Continental right, threatening the integrity of the entire line. Officers struggled to organize retreating units, attempting to maintain discipline, while soldiers fell back toward more defensible positions along the Brandywine. Washington rode among the troops, issuing orders and encouraging men, his presence a steadying force amid mounting confusion and fear. Lafayette, still recovering from his leg wound, continued to direct artillery and coordinate defensive efforts, demonstrating remarkable courage under intense fire. The British exploited every gap, pushing forward in tight formations while firing volleys and advancing steadily with bayonets fixed for close combat. Continental artillery crews struggled to reload under pressure, their efforts slowed by smoke, heat, and the constant threat of flanking fire. Maxwell's light infantry executed strategic withdrawals, engaging in brief skirmishes to slow British momentum while avoiding encirclement and annihilation. Casimir Pulaski's cavalry conducted daring charges where possible, targeting British officers and supply wagons to disrupt communications and slow the advance. Monroe moved swiftly across the battlefield, assisting Lafayette and relaying urgent information between divisions, his presence critical for maintaining lines of coordination. Despite heroic efforts, the flanking maneuver was largely successful, forcing the Continental Army to abandon key positions and regroup further inland. American soldiers retreated across fences, ditches, and fields, often under heavy fire, their movements slowed by uneven terrain and exhausted legs. British units under Cornwallis and Howe advanced with calculated precision, pressing their advantage while maintaining cohesive lines to prevent American counterattacks. The morning clash at Chadds Ford remained intense, but the flanking threat now overshadowed the frontal skirmishes, drawing Washington's attention and reserves. Lafayette's aides worked tirelessly to distribute reinforcements, coordinate artillery placements, and prevent the right flank from collapsing entirely. Pulaski's cavalry made repeated attempts to harass British columns, yet dense forests and muddy fields limited their effectiveness against disciplined infantry. American units farther west tried to hold strategic hills and crossroads, but communication delays prevented unified action, allowing British forces to exploit weak points. Casualties mounted steadily, with soldiers on both sides falling to musket fire, cannon shot, and the chaos of close quarters fighting. Washington's staff struggled to maintain cohesion, relaying messages across miles of smoke-filled battlefield, while adjusting to the evolving situation in real time. Despite the setbacks, morale remained remarkably resilient among key Continental units, inspired by the leadership of Lafayette, Pulaski, and other officers. Monroe continued to shuttle between positions, ensuring wounded officers received attention, and that the chain of command remained functional under extreme pressure. By midday, the Americans recognized the severity of the British flanking success, forcing a series of strategic withdrawals to avoid encirclement and preserve the army. Every movement was deliberate, balancing the need to retreat with the necessity of maintaining a force capable of fighting another day. As the flanking maneuver unfolded, Washington realized that immediate action was necessary to prevent the total collapse of his right wing. He dispatched reinforcements from Greene's and Wayne's divisions, attempting to stabilize the line and slow the advancing British troops. Lafayette, still weak from his earlier leg wound, remained on horseback, directing artillery and encouraging retreating soldiers to regroup and resist. The young French officer moved along exposed paths, ignoring falling shot, his determination inspiring both officers and enlisted men to hold their ground. Pulaski's cavalry maneuvered to cover gaps in the retreat, executing quick charges against British units while falling back to avoid encirclement. These cavalry actions disrupted British advances temporarily, buying critical minutes for Continental forces to reorganize along new defensive positions. American infantry formed secondary lines behind fences and small ridges, firing disciplined volleys into the advancing redcoats despite exhaustion and fear. Knyphausen continued pressing at Chad's Ford, engaging in bloody firefights that forced American units to yield ground under superior numbers. Meanwhile, Cornwallis and Howe's flanking columns began to descend upon the exposed right, threatening to cut off retreat paths entirely. Washington coordinated his forces with urgency, sending messengers to relay orders for brigades to support threatened sectors of the line. John Marshall, serving with Maxwell's light infantry, helped organize skirmishers to slow the British approach and protect the Army's retreat. The dense woods and rolling terrain offered some cover, yet soldiers faced constant musket and artillery fire, with casualties mounting rapidly. Lafayette, despite blood loss, refused to abandon his post, rallying troops who were faltering under pressure from multiple directions. Monroe rode to Lafayette's side, using his knowledge of French to communicate urgent instructions and assess the young officer's condition. Pulaski's cavalry made repeated attempts to strike at British officers, targeting key positions to sow confusion, though the enemy maintained disciplined formations. Washington ordered the artillery to reposition where possible, directing fire to cover withdrawal routes and create choke points for pursuing British troops. Skirmishers delayed the British advance intermittently, yet Howe and Cornwallis exploited every weakness, steadily forcing the Continental Army back toward defensible high ground. American lines wavered under the pressure, with soldiers retreating across open fields and fences, yet the leadership of Lafayette and others prevented complete disintegration. Despite injuries and fatigue, officers worked to maintain order, reposition units, and ensure that retreating men avoided surrender or unnecessary casualties. By late morning, the flanking maneuver had effectively unhinged the American right, though pockets of resistance continued, led by determined officers and brave enlisted men. Pulaski's cavalry provided crucial reconnaissance, reporting on British movements, and warning Washington where reinforcements were most needed during the chaotic withdrawal. The coordination between infantry, artillery, and cavalry became a delicate dance, as Washington balanced retreat with the imperative to prevent rout and maintain army cohesion. As the battle reached its peak intensity, British forces pressed forward relentlessly, driving the Continental Army from its positions across the Brandywine. American soldiers, though exhausted and outnumbered, continued to fire volleys while retreating, using fences, ridges, and natural cover to slow the British advance. Lafayette, wounded but undeterred, coordinated artillery placements and infantry withdrawals, ensuring that as many men as possible avoided encirclement. Monroe stayed close to Lafayette, assisting with communication and moving between units to relay Washington's orders across the chaotic battlefield. Pulaski's cavalry attempted repeated charges against British flanks, targeting officers and supply wagons, though terrain and numbers limited the impact of these bold maneuvers. Casualties mounted steadily, with both sides suffering losses from musket fire, artillery, and the confusion of close-quarters combat across uneven ground. Key American officers, including Greene and Wayne, worked tirelessly to reorganize retreating brigades, preventing the army from disintegrating under pressure. The British, though victorious in advancing and taking ground, encountered resistance in scattered pockets, forcing them to move cautiously and maintain cohesion. Washington recognized the need to preserve his army for future engagements, ordering a controlled withdrawal rather than risking annihilation in a last stand. The withdrawal was executed with remarkable discipline considering the circumstances, as officers used terrain and skirmishers to cover retreating soldiers. Lafayette's leadership proved critical, maintaining morale and preventing panic, while Pulaski's cavalry harassed pursuing British units to delay any further advance. John Marshall and other light infantry officers continued to engage in skirmishes, covering the army's rear and slowing British pursuit wherever possible. By late afternoon, the British had secured the battlefield but failed to destroy the Continental Army, which retreated in order to new defensive positions farther inland. The Americans' disciplined withdrawal allowed them to regroup and continue resisting, though the cost in casualties and morale was significant. Among the wounded was Lafayette, whose injury would remove him temporarily from field command. Yet his bravery became legendary among both soldiers and officers. Pulaski's cavalry had demonstrated the potential of mobile units, even in the face of overwhelming numbers, foreshadowing his later contributions to the Revolutionary War. Washington, surveying the aftermath, understood that Philadelphia was now vulnerable to occupation, yet he had preserved the army, keeping the revolution alive. The battle demonstrated both the skill of British generals in maneuver and the resilience of the Continental Army under desperate circumstances. While British forces celebrated their tactical victory, the Americans learned invaluable lessons in discipline, leadership, and the importance of intelligence on troop movements. Casualties, though not massive compared to later battles, were enough to deeply affect morale, prompting Washington to consider future strategies for confronting superior forces. The battlefield, strewn with fallen soldiers, shattered equipment, and broken lines, bore witness to the courage and sacrifice on both sides during the day's fierce combat. By nightfall, the American army had regrouped along more defensible positions, ready to continue the fight for independence despite the loss of Philadelphia. The Battle of Brandywine had ended, leaving the British in possession of the field, yet failing to deliver the decisive blow they had hoped for in the larger war effort. The Battle of Brandywine concluded with the British securing the field, yet the Continental Army, though forced to retreat, remained largely intact. Washington's careful withdrawal prevented a complete disaster, preserving the core of his army for future engagements despite the heavy losses sustained. Casualties were significant. Hundreds of Continental soldiers had fallen, and many more were wounded or captured, leaving the army shaken, but still capable of fighting. The Americans' retreat toward Chester and Wilmington allowed them to regroup, fortify positions, and tend to the wounded, including key officers like Lafayette. Monroe stayed close to Lafayette, overseeing his care and ensuring that communications regarding troop movements continued despite the confusion of the battlefield. Pulaski's cavalry, though unable to prevent the British advance, played a vital role in covering the retreat and protecting American soldiers from complete rout. Washington's leadership throughout the withdrawal demonstrated remarkable discipline, keeping men organized under fire and ensuring that morale did not collapse entirely. The British, triumphant, advanced toward Philadelphia, eager to capture the city and deliver a decisive blow to the rebel cause. Philadelphia, the largest city in the colonies and the seat of the Continental Congress, symbolized both political and economic authority, making its loss deeply significant. British occupation of Philadelphia allowed Howe to establish headquarters, enforce order, and disrupt American governance, yet it did not crush the revolutionary spirit. The retreating Continental Army regrouped in the countryside, using defensive positions and natural terrain to shield themselves from pursuit while conserving remaining forces. Washington understood that survival, rather than immediate victory, was critical, as the Continental Army's continued existence was essential for sustaining the war effort. Morale among the American soldiers was mixed. Despair at the loss of Philadelphia combined with pride in their orderly withdrawal under overwhelming odds. News of the battle spread quickly, reaching Congress, citizens, and foreign observers, painting a complex picture of both defeat and resilience. France, observing closely, saw that while the Americans could suffer defeat, they were capable of preserving their army and continuing resistance, a sign of strategic competence. This realization influenced French calculations regarding whether to commit more overt support to the revolutionary cause, weighing risk against opportunity. The British were encouraged by their success, but they too faced challenges in holding Philadelphia and supplying their forces far from Loyalist strongholds. The battle revealed critical lessons for Washington and his generals: the importance of intelligence, reconnaissance, and flexibility in the face of superior forces. Future officers, including John Marshall, learned firsthand about the harsh realities of war and the necessity of maintaining order amidst confusion and retreat. Casualty reports included both losses from combat and sickness, underscoring the vulnerability of 18th century armies to not only enemy fire but also disease and logistical strain. The experiences of soldiers, officers, and foreign allies like Pulaski and Lafayette highlighted the international dimension of the war and the value of coordination across diverse forces. Washington continued to maintain communication lines with Congress, ensuring that political leaders understood both the risks and achievements of his army's actions. Despite losing Philadelphia, the Continental Army remained a symbol of American determination, proving that the Revolution's cause extended beyond any single city or battle. The aftermath of Brandywine emphasized endurance over immediate victory, teaching Americans that strategic retreats could preserve life and maintain long-term resistance. Over the following weeks, troops recovered, reorganized, and prepared for subsequent engagements, carrying with them lessons learned in leadership, maneuvering, and battlefield resilience. Pulaski, Lafayette, and other foreign officers continued their vital roles, both in training and in bolstering the morale of American troops facing future confrontations. In summary, the aftermath of the Battle of Brandywine was complex: a tactical British victory, a strategic American survival, and a testament to leadership, courage, and the unbroken will of a nascent nation.